Welcome to our latest podcast episode. I'm your host, Charlotte, and I'm here today with Peter and Andy. Welcome. Before we get started, obviously we're here to talk about SecOps today, but before we do, why don't you guys just take a minute to introduce yourselves?
Great, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. So my name is Peter Jones. I'm a cybersecurity specialist. I've been in the industry for longer than I care to remember, mainly focused on public sector.
Yep, excellent. Andy?
Hi Charlotte,
Hi.
My name is Andy Legrice. I'm the security practice lead. Work with Peter and our wider teams to ensure we deliver the services that our clients expect us to deliver.
Excellent. Well, it's really nice to have you both here. I'm actually quite looking forward to this conversation because cybersecurity is obviously a big issue at the moment. Everybody's talking about it. And specifically, we're here today to talk about it with regards to the public sector and some of the unique challenges that they have. Might be good to start on how has the landscape around this changed for the public sector over the last few years?
Oh, I can probably pick up on that. It's changed massively, and I think the most daunting thing is that those changes are only accelerating going forward. So, if we take a look back a few years, we can go pre-pandemic when everyone was typically working within their network. Obviously, pandemic hit, everybody started to work from home, and no one really came back. So now pretty much everybody is able to work in a hybrid environment, a couple of days in the office, a couple of days at home. That has clearly expanded the attack surface massively. So we have that remote work issue, which is obviously a bit of a challenge. But we also then, if you look back over the last few years, cloud first was a massive topic for everybody. That's pulled back a little bit now. Everyone went all into the cloud. Then they realised potentially how much it can cost, and they've pulled it back. So now, again, most people are in this sort of hybrid environment where they have plenty of applications within their on-prem data centre, but they're also then using some applications either in an IaaS environment or in a SaaS environment. And I think probably the third main challenge is the threats and how they've evolved over time. Obviously, with the expanded attack surface, we've got more to cover, we've got more to think about, which is a challenge in itself. But with AI, of course, coming down the road, this has now increased the speed of attacks that we're seeing dramatically. From that point of identifying a vulnerability to the point that that vulnerability is breached has reduced dramatically. So I think from my point of view, that's probably the key areas.
I totally agree. I mean, there's one key point as well that has become pretty obvious over recent years, and that is the fact that there's real competition for the skills, the people skills, the capability that form a key part of an organisation's defence and ability to cope with the demands on an organisation to provide effective cyber defences. So as well as all of the technical advances and therefore the advances in the threats that every organisation faces, which has meant they have to evolve their defences from a technical perspective. There's also the people skills, those security specialists to consider, and that's where we see a lot of the challenges, isn't it, around the sector?
Yeah, it really is.
It's interesting, isn't it? Especially what you say about speed of response, because I'm guessing a lot of the way things are currently set up is to detect things over time, maybe in weeks, but now it's shrunk down to hours as to when things can drastically change.
That's right.
So you touched on skills shortages there. So what's the biggest impact of those skills shortages on the public sector, and what can they do about it? Because obviously one of the challenges for the public sector is a lack of resources, not just people but money, financial resources, and often they struggle to compete with the private sector. So what are some of the impacts of that you see?
Yeah, it's massive, and it's a major challenge for everybody. In fact, there's a common theme actually that works through most of the conversations that we have. Obviously, every organisation has their own unique challenges, but in almost every conversation, it's that lack of resource. It's like, no one's ever told me they've got more than enough money and how can I spend it? So not had that conversation yet, still waiting for it.
Yeah.
Definitely a lack of people. So again, as the security architecture has evolved over the years, most organizations are dealing with maybe 20 or 30 different security tools. And when you've only got maybe 1 or 2 people that are responsible for managing those tools, it becomes incredibly challenging. So certainly it's the lack of budget, it's the lack of people, but it's also the lack of skills or specialism to be able to utilize the tools that are in place effectively, which I think really is an issue.
And what we often see is, sadly, as we're aware, many IT projects fail to deliver the promises that they claim to deliver up front.
Yeah.
And cybersecurity is no different. So when technical solutions are rushed into place or partially deployed, that typically creates a lot of friction for end users. And sadly, it increases the admin overhead for the security analysts and the operations teams. We were talking to an NHS trust recently around the use of Microsoft conditional access, and their deployment was not quite as considered as it may have been. So what they've been doing is simply turning it off when users need to access services, but they're doing that in a rather crude way. So the user is impacted, the security of the organization is certainly impacted, and of course the workload for the team, the security operations team, increases. So the lack of skills that may well exist in many organizations at the point of deploying technical controls leads to a rather significant knock-on effect.
Interesting. Interesting.
I can probably extend that actually. The number of times I've walked into an account and they've talked through the security controls they have in place, and it typically gets to the IPS, the intrusion prevention system, and they spend a lot of money on this thing. They're expensive tools, and the number of times I've heard, it was producing an awful lot of alerts. It was flashing all of the time, and we just decided to turn it down until it stopped flashing. And okay, that's not exactly the point, but all right.
See, people never allow for human behaviour, do they, and human adaptation to stress points when they're just designing these processes. So one of the points you mentioned at the beginning was around visibility across the estate. You mentioned that right at the beginning. So what are the risks there? Is it just about spotting vulnerabilities? And what do many people miss? And to your point that you just said, where you don't accommodate for human behaviour, what are the things that they often miss or don't consider?
Yeah, this is another really common theme across all of our accounts. You can, when we qualify accounts, we obviously talk through the estate and how they're managing the various components within the estate. One of the questions I ask is, how confident are you that you understand exactly what's connecting to your network? And the response is generally, yeah. Sort of, I think I've got a good idea. And, honestly, that's simply not good enough in today's world. You could almost get away with it in yesterday's world, but right now, with the speed of attacks and how they're happening, it really is absolutely critical to understand exactly what's connecting to your network, how it's connecting to the network, and obviously what you need to do to protect it. If you can't see it, then you can't protect it. So visibility is absolutely key. And typically, it's generally okay for the IT estate. Most people know which users are connecting in. But as soon as you look at IoT devices, cameras, air quality sensors, anything like that, that's typically the estate's problem. It's somebody else's issue. Or we've put it into a zone where we don't need to worry about it. And the bottom line is you do. You know, that's the low-hanging fruit for most hackers to come into an organization, target the stuff that is not being updated or patched regularly. And then once you're in, you've got that opportunity for lateral movement.
Yeah, and of course, when you've established that visibility, to some extent, the problem moves on, doesn't it? You then have the visibility, and you suddenly realise how many vulnerabilities you do have in your estate, and then you have to carefully consider how you go about prioritising those vulnerabilities, how you go about remediating the risk associated with those vulnerabilities.
Yeah,
so
most organisations are absolutely overwhelmed by the number of vulnerabilities they have.
Absolutely, and some of them may be associated with services or devices that just aren't used or just don't offer any significant value to the organisation. So once you've established that visibility, you then have to prioritise how you're going to mitigate the risks associated with those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and that's quite a minefield to unpick, isn't it, given some of the other things you've been talking about. So they haven't got bottomless resources financially or people to solve the problem. And if you've got different teams responsible for managing those, like you say, you've got facilities management who might be responsible for cameras, you've got utilities that might be responsible for other types of equipment. Where do you even start, and how do you even prioritise that? And I guess that must feel quite overwhelming for these organisations.
It really is. And again, you know, these things are built up over many, many years. And typically it's responding to the latest threat that's come into that market at that particular time. So you do end up with this whole, Frankenstein of a sort of security architecture built up of many, many different security controls. So I'd suggest, you know, for the organisations that are limited on resource and really thinking about how they can optimise their capabilities, think about the security architecture as a whole. So, maybe take a step back and think about all of the security controls that exist within the architecture. Now, that could be everything, of course, from your endpoint security, but it goes through email security, your identity access management, your web proxies, your firewalls, your IPS, your IDS, behavioral analytics. It goes into the cloud and all of those controls as well. Take a look at that list of controls that you have and ask yourself just, are they serving you? Are they integrated? Are they sharing threat intelligence? And are you able to monitor those controls in a way that will allow you to have an effective response in the event of a breach? I've got to say, for a lot of our accounts, the answer to that question right now is no. And if that is the answer, then it really is time to either do your own review, your own gap analysis, and see really how you can improve those integrations, or talk to a trusted third party and bring those specialists in to do that security maturity assessment, understand where those gaps are, and then talk about how we can build up on those integrations to be able to present the data in a way that can make your teams as effective as they can possibly be, given the limitations that you have.
And that's exactly where we spend a lot of our time. So effectively making best use of what our customer organisations already have. So typically there's a lot of capability that's left untouched from, let's say, for example, from a Microsoft perspective, where there might be an enterprise agreement that offers a lot of services and capability, particularly from a security perspective. But coming back to the skills shortages that many organisations face and the fast-moving pace of change, the demands on the IT team as a whole, often capabilities are left sitting on the shelf, as people say, which could be put to good use. And not only put to good use, but deployed in an effective, efficient way that helps the administrators reduce their workload, reduces friction from an end user perspective. So we do spend a lot of time working with our clients on exactly that area.
Yeah, and this is where the public sector actually generally have a real advantage, because whether you're talking sort of education or whether you're talking health, there's an opportunity there to have licensing at a relatively low cost. So, for instance, in the university sector, most of the universities we find have a Microsoft A5 license. Mm-hmm. That's a very, very powerful license, giving you a whole range of security controls that, honestly, most of the time are not actually optimized completely. But the same is true from the networking world. If you're sort of a networking-led organization, there are security controls within, Cisco Identity Services Engine, for instance, that can really give you some advantages to segment the network effectively and really improve the security profile of your organization. So looking at the existing licenses that you have today and how you can optimize them, I think is absolutely key.
And that probably helps from a cost perspective as well, doesn't it, in terms of optimising on the licenses and maybe understanding what they do and don't need, which can help then fund other sort of security initiatives.
And where there's overlap as well. It's like, where can you maybe get rid of some of these controls because it's handled in a different way elsewhere.
Yeah. And I guess as well, it's interesting, I know I'm digressing very slightly, so, but looking at things holistically, to your point, must be very necessary, because I guess it's like any complex environment, changing something over here could inadvertently impact something negatively elsewhere, or more than one thing. So are there times when you've seen that and sort of how can they sort of make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, absolutely. And sometimes what we do see is planned change leading to enforced unplanned change from a security perspective. So where we have diverse organizations in terms of siloed teams within that organization, a key feature is to ensure that the culture around security is in place, so that security is always considered along with any as a fundamental element of any IT project. Now, I think things have improved from where things were many years ago, but we still see security teams struggling to respond to changes that are taking place, either planned or unplanned, within the organisation.
I think just to add to that, it's also a really good practice to go back to basics. It's again, just talking about that visibility. Ask yourself, do we know exactly where our critical assets are? Mm-hmm. Especially now as we're moving into cloud, and these applications and the data stores are now moving around in various.
They're
locations.
not in little black boxes in the corner.
They're not in that little box, exactly. Yeah. So understand where the data is held.
Yeah.
Do you know who owns that data? Who is the line of business manager that is actually responsible for that piece of data? And is that line of business manager applying the security policies that are relevant for that data? Again, it's worth having a check and a review of that, because you do lose track over time of where this data is held and who's got actually responsibility for applying the security policy that is relevant for that data.
And documenting who that is, and sort of managing when people exit the organisation. Is that knowledge retained? Yeah,
absolutely. Yes.
We've talked a lot about prevention, detection, and visibility. But in your opinion, I think I know what the answer might be, do organisations spend enough time preparing how to respond to a breach? So when something happens, and I know that often it's not the organisation that knows there's been a breach. Often it's a third party that's been impacted, lets them know. So do organisations spend enough time on that?
So I think some do, but unfortunately they are the minority. And I think we've covered a number of reasons as to why this is the case. There's a lot of the time the teams are understandably effectively trying to keep the lights on, keep things running from a day-to-day perspective. And often where there are proactive planning sessions put in place around disaster recovery or incident response planning, etc., they tend to fall by the wayside at that point in time. But they are obviously very, very important. So a lot of this is about processes. It's not really about the technology.
Yeah.
So the technology, the controls from a security perspective help prevent that incident, that breach in the first place, and they also help tell us when that incident has occurred. So sooner rather than later is obviously good, and there is a slight shift towards detection rather than prevention, because many organisations accept that they will sadly ultimately be breached at some point.
Yeah.
But planning is absolutely key. So ensuring that all of the stakeholders across the organisation are aware of what to do, what their role is when an incident occurs. Depending on what type of incident it is, will dictate exactly what that response is going to be. So putting aside some time to run through different scenarios will help the organisation determine what their course of action should be, what the implications are, what they need to ready themselves for in the event of that becoming a reality. But also they may determine that they will need some outside help. So if there's a catastrophic incident, they may need to call on some specialists to assist them for a speedy and meaningful, effective recovery. So really, it's all about planning, isn't it?
Yeah, it's that preemptive action, isn't it?
Which human beings are so good at.
Well, exactly. Yes, that's right. Certainly, when you're planning for a breach, because you should absolutely expect that a breach is going to happen at any point. The best thing is, of course, to be prepared. So, talk about bringing in third parties. It's almost a little bit too late if the breach has already happened to bring in that third party. Obviously, if you're in that situation, bring in the specialists as quickly as you can. But the best way to do it, if possible, is engage with that third party in advance. As you say, do the tabletop exercises, do the walkthroughs, prepare for the breach, and then practice. Yeah. So run through those exercises as long as you can, and ensure that everything that you prepare for is maintained and kept up to date, not just put in a drawer and forgotten about till next year.
Yeah.
And of course ensuring those plans are going to be available if the worst does happen, rather than sitting in a cloud service that you can no longer access.
Yeah, that's right.
Very good point.
That's true.
No, it's a good point. I know someone who works in contingency and business recovery, and they insist everyone has a hard copy in a locked area in the office, because if the cloud goes down, then where do you go?
Absolutely. It sounds almost comical, but it's true, and often the first point of failure.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, if you are really short of resources, and if you don't have a great budget, you don't have a lot of people, probably one of the most powerful things that you can have is a piece of paper with a list on it.
Yeah.
It's a list of, if anything goes wrong, who do I call? If they're not available, who else can I call?
Yeah.
Who's responsible for which action, and are they aware that they're responsible for that action? And in which order should I go through this list in order to respond effectively? If you have that one piece of paper, you're generally ahead of the game.
I love that. I love how simple that is, because it's all in people's heads, isn't it? And people know information. So yeah, I like that.
There's some good guidance on the NCSC website actually about planning. For instance, obviously how to prevent them. There's a lot of time dedicated to that, but how to respond in the event of an incident. So a lot of it, as we've already covered, is common sense, and the NCSC have done a good job of guiding people in the right direction. So it's well worth a look on their website.
Yeah, good. All right, we'll put a link to that on the screen. So just sort of ahead of wrapping up, just got a couple more questions, and actually one of them sort of leads on nicely from that simple paper list. I really like that idea. But what are some other sort of offset options for public sector organisations that are really pushed for budget and resource, who want to do all of those things? I guess, what are the top things they should be doing, and how can they offset smaller budgets?
Yeah, so Peter's talked about getting the basics right, which is often easier said than done, but it is true. So if we really do go back to basics, what we are looking at is ensuring that we are minimizing our attack surface. So what that really means is turning off any services, any devices that we're not using to reduce that opportunity for the threat actors. We need to be on top of our patching, and we've talked about backups. So ensuring that our backups are in place. All of these things are known good. I nearly said best practice, but they're good fundamental practices that we should be following from both a disaster recovery and a cybersecurity perspective. And then we can build out processes on top of them. And we're not talking about complex processes. And one of the most effective ways that we have found pushes modest-sized organisations to maintain such standards is by gaining and then retaining Cyber Essentials, because the NCSC's Cyber Essentials programme is all about getting the basics right. And being able to demonstrate that you have a sound grasp of the requirements of good cybersecurity hygiene.
So if they do that, they're in a pretty strong position. So how would they weave in, so obviously endpoint devices, and you touched on, I think you both spoke about hybrid working earlier. What's a good basic way for them to get control of that part of it? Because that's the hardest bit to control, isn't it?
Well, it's a challenging bit to control, and it's changed very recently, of course, with the pandemic, with people moving to a remote work situation. And it was interesting to watch, actually, to go through this process, because when the pandemic first hit, there was a knee-jerk reaction to enable people to work from home. And therefore, we saw this massive uptake of VPN capability, upgrading the VPN concentrators to be able to bring in more and more connections. And that was great, and it worked very well, and people managed to overcome that hurdle very, very effectively. Now we're a little bit more mature. We recognize this is going to be very much for the long term. And VPN does have its challenges. It was a technology that was very much evolved to enable users to connect through and connect onto the network, and then, of course, connect through to the data center. But now, as those users are connecting directly to cloud-based SaaS applications, or maybe going to IaaS applications, the need to backhaul all of that data into the core network and go through that central security stack is now reduced, and it doesn't actually help the user experience as well. It delays that process.
Often slows it right down, doesn't it?
So VPN is fine. However, if you have an opportunity to think about zero trust access and establishing that per user, per device, session-based access to the application, where you can actually not only improve the security for that particular individual at home, but you can also improve the user experience as well. It's a sort of win-win all round. Then that's a very positive thing to build up your capability for remote work.
And you're typically reducing costs at your central or hub sites by reducing the bandwidth that's required,
of course.
Tromboning the traffic into the network and straight back out again. And typically these connections are terminated on firewalls, so they're having to work less hard. The firewall spec could arguably come down. So I think if we were to start from scratch, we would not really design today's or yesterday's VPN services to allow connectivity to services that are largely cloud-driven, cloud-hosted.
That's right. And again, at that point, you have the opportunity to use a completely unified security policy across all of your users.
Nice.
Which actually makes it easier for the SecOps team as well to manage and control. And it also then gives them visibility of exactly what's going on and how these connections are being established. Visibility of all of the workflows, both client to server and also server to server workflows as well. And if you have that level of visibility, then you're actually putting yourself in a great position to be able to respond effectively if you are breached.
Which circles back very nicely to the beginning of what we were talking about with that holistic view. So just to finish up on, because I think I know this is a question you guys get a lot, is and maybe if you can squeeze it into 3 points, then do. But how can they leverage their existing infrastructure? You touched on tools earlier, sort of making sure they're getting the most out of those, but how can they do it with what they already have? What are some of the things they should consider?
Well, I think from my point of view, it will be really understand your existing licensing. It's think about what you have in place right now, what capabilities. Do you have an A5 license from Microsoft? Do you have any maybe capabilities within your networking estate that you can perhaps leverage? Look at that and see whether you can enable your security architecture to start working for you rather than against you. Mm-hmm. So thinking about those integrations, thinking about how those security controls are presenting themselves to enable you to understand the full extent of a breach. And then, again, it's leading back to that ability to be able to respond effectively if you do notice those things happening.
Yeah, and associated with that, because many or most, arguably, security services are delivered via the cloud, features are being added all the time, features, capabilities. So many organisations don't know that they have much improved capability sitting there waiting to be used. So it's not as though they haven't necessarily enabled the use of a license or a service, but that service itself has evolved. So again, we spend a reasonable amount of time working with our clients to ensure that they understand and they know what is available to them. So it's a similar point, but it's slightly different.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It's a very good point. And so thank you both for your time today. I've found it genuinely very interesting. And what's nice to hear is that while there's a lot that you can do, and there's a lot that you have to consider, there were some great points that came across that I think will make it quite practical for public sector organisations to make a start and at least see that they've got even with limited resources, they can make a start and do effective things to get to that, like you say, that good practice stuff. So
that's absolutely true.
Thanks both very much.
Great.
Thank you.
Charlotte.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.